So, it's 1981, and Sam Raimi at the age of 22 has just written and directed one of the best and most successful independent horror films of all time, The Evil Dead. A movie essentially made by kids out in the woods for no money goes on to premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, is publicly heralded by Stephen King, would make millions of dollars and start a franchise of 4 film sequels, a television show, as well as comics, video games, and 2 different stage musicals. It would start the careers of not only himself, but also for Bruce Campbell and the Coen brothers, and would as well down the road indirectly jumpstart the careers of actors such as James Franco, John Goodman, Steve Buscemi, Scarlett Johansson, and Frances McDormand, as well as many others, and would also start a very recognizable trademark style that would be replicated by other genre filmmakers on into present day. None of those things would have happened in the way that they did without The Evil Dead. And they almost didn't happen because of a movie called Crime Wave. So, you've just made Evil Dead. Where do you go from there? What do you do when you've made an instant classic film that is culturally important to a large group of people at an age when you're barely able to legally drink? Well, before we get to that, we have to start with Bruce Campbell. After the success of Evil Dead, Campbell was struggling to figure out what direction to take his life in. He had been acting on and off for a decade by this point, but had never really made any money at it. Some bits here and there, but certainly nothing that could be considered to be an actual livable income. And problems came from trying to be an actor in a business without really knowing much about how that business works. For example, he was trying to figure out how to star in his next movie while still living in Detroit. His official headshot was him with a goofy button-up while eating a bag of chips, and he wasn't even a member of the Screen Actors Guild. The best offers for a while that he was getting were background roles in local Detroit commercials, and would eventually for a short while become the spokesperson for Radio Snake in their television ads. It wasn't until a full 2 years after Evil Dead's release that he got offered a paying role with speaking lines for something that wasn't an advertisement, on the soap opera Generations, which has been so forgotten that I can't find pictures of them making it, let alone video evidence, and should not be confused with the much more well-known 1989 soap opera of the same name. The only living cultural evidence of it existing is that it is what Grimsrud is watching on the TV, in the cabin scene of the Coen brothers' 1996 film, Fargo. So, technically, Bruce Campbell was in Fargo before he was ever in Fargo. It was on this show that he would meet his first wife, who was also his co-star, Christine DeVoe. They quickly, after meeting, would fall in love, and by the time they had married, Generations would already be cancelled, and Campbell would again find himself unemployed. DeVoe, by the way, was indirectly the reason that Campbell was only in the first scene of 1989's Maniac Cop 2, before being swiftly killed off, as their messy divorce was taking too much energy from him to fully devote to starring in the sequel. A friend of his from Detroit, Ron Teachworth, had a hitchhiking drama script about 2 friends making their way across the country that he wanted to film called Going Back, and he offered one of the 2 lead roles to Campbell. It was made in 2 weeks for no money and was seen by pretty much nobody. And it didn't help his career except for him now being able to say that he had starred in 2 films instead of 1. I've never seen this, so I can't attest to it, but to me it does actually look pretty charming and I would like to watch it one day. Throughout all this time, Sam Raimi was having a similar struggle of figuring out where to take his career. He had several scripts that he was interested in producing, but the primary one that he wanted to work on the most was for a Hitchcock-inspired film called Relentless, about a regular everyman who through just doing his job gets caught up in a web of lies, deceit, murder, and mayhem. By all accounts, the script was horrible, and Raimi knew this, and was actively looking for someone to get in and rewrite it to make it work. Which, it's good that he recognized early that writing was not what he was the strongest at, as Evil Dead would be the only film in his career that he would write by himself. Everything else from here on that he directed would be co-written by him or not written by him at all. And I think it shows an artistic maturity early on for him to recognize his strengths at what he was good at and not so strong with. Too many young artists try to do everything at once and get burned out easily, instead of asking for help in a collaborative medium. At Irvin Shapiro's suggestion, who had worked with directors such as Kubrick, Romero, and Scorsese, the title was changed to The XYZ Murders, because he said that a film with an X in the title would be more enticing to audiences. So it is here that the Coens enter the picture again. I say again because, believe it or not, Joel Cohen was one of the 2 film editors that worked on The Evil Dead, and it was the first professional film job that either of the brothers had. Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell had known each other for years prior to that, but it was on that project that Campbell had gotten close with the Coens. Raimi didn't have a very high initial impression of them, but Campbell told them that he had to read their new script that they had just finished called Blood Simple, which he did, saying, "You know, Joel's brother Ethan was just a statistical accountant at Macy's at the time, and I thought it's probably going to be awful, but I'll read it because I like Joel. And I read it and I thought, this is a really great script. These guys know how to write scripts. I needed help because ours was no good and they came in and helped me with it. So they stepped in and helped doctor the script to the point of eventually being credited as co-writers on the project, while at the same time trying to find funding to make Blood Simple. They even put together this fake trailer that you're watching now for the movie, based on the script, to try and secure money to make the film, and had Bruce Campbell stand in for the shots in the role of Julian. This investor trailer was actually even shot by Barry Sonnenfeld, who would go on to direct The Addams Family, Men in Black, Get Shorty, and Wild Wild West. As you probably know, Blood Simple would go on to be a massive cultural hit in 1984, and Joel and Ethan Coen stopped just being Joel and Ethan Coen and became the Coen brothers. So now you've got this neo-noir horror mystery script that was co-written by the guy who made The Evil Dead, which was one of the most successful independent horror films in recent memory, as well as co-written by the guys who just made Blood Simple, that was critically very well received, who were already in the early stages of developing their next project, Raising Arizona. It would be an understatement to say that the idea was heavily in the air that this script could be the next big thing. The speculation on the future of the young talent here was really intense, and after shopping it around, they agreed to partner with Norman Lear at Embassy Pictures, based on the agreement that Raimi would be given total creative control on the production of the film. The first red flag for them should have been immediately after this agreement. Norman Lear told them to change the name of the film to Crime Wave, which they did. Working with Embassy Pictures in this time in particular was a pretty big deal. They weren't one of the major studios, but they had a lot of prestige attached to their name, especially within horror. In a way, they could almost be compared to the modern equivalent of A24, only a little less artsy. By this time, they were well known for their horror output, releasing films such as Phantasm, The Fog, Death Ship, Prom Night, Scanners, Fear No Evil, The Howling, Dead and Buried, and Escape from New York. And that was just the late 70s and early 80s. They had a long history of great films, both horror and non-horror, like Psychic Killer, The Photographer, The Graduate, The Producers, The Night Porter, Watership Down, and The Lion in the Winter. There was a certain status for a few years associated with the Avco Embassy name. In 1982, Norman Lear, known for his legendary sitcoms such as All in the Family, The Jeffersons, Maude, Good Times, and Sanford & Son, purchased the company and immediately won an Oscar for the release of Fanny and Alexander. He also gave former All in the Family co-star Rob Reiner his first chance as a filmmaker, producing Spinal Tap, The Sure Thing, and Stand By Me, before he would move on to 20th Century Fox for The Princess Bride. And I put an emphasis on all of this because I really want to stress that Sam Raimi skipped that all-important middle ground step as a creator, of actually learning how the business aspects of making this kind of art works. He went from playing in the woods with his friends to making a movie for one of the most interesting and prestigious studios at this time in the 80s, without really learning what exactly that means. There wasn't a gradual progression there. Sometimes rising up the ladder over a number of years is a good thing. From Bruce Campbell's perspective, the first moment he really realized that this wasn't going to go well was when he was told that he was going to have to audition for the lead of the film. As Norman Lear and the other executives were shocked when Raimi wanted to again hire his high school friend to lead the project instead of getting an actual movie star. They filmed one scene with Campbell as the lead role of Victor Ajax. Production was paused while they waited for word from the studio, which eventually came back saying that under no circumstances could Bruce Campbell star in this movie. So, obliging them, he was then cast as the character of Ronaldo, who was given more prominence in the script, so that Campbell could at least hang out on set for the entirety of production. And he was given a producer role in the film as well for compensation. Even though he was really upset at the time, he has in recent years admitted that he is quite thankful that this happened, because starring in Crime Wave could have been the real end of his career that had just begun. He said on working with Hollywood actors at the time that, because I was a co-producer and part-time actor, I found myself dealing with actors, or rather with the actors' problems. By the time the shoot ended, I could have published a doctoral thesis on insanity. Louise Lasser, days into production, fired her makeup artist because she didn't like the way that she was making her look, deciding to do her own makeup for the remainder of the film, and refusing to work if she wasn't allowed to do this. The entire cast and crew behind her back made constant jokes at her expense for looking like a clown. Brian James, most well known for his role in Blade Runner, who died of a heart attack at age 54, was well known for having a serious coke problem, and one night completely destroyed his hotel room and the production had to pay for all the repairs. He even ripped out all of the wiring from the walls of his room and pulled the light fixtures out of the ceiling. His explanation, when later asked, was that the room had been haunted by the ghost of his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend. Reed Birney, who was the studio's choice to replace Campbell as the lead, was similarly just starting his career. He had been acting for almost a decade, but almost exclusively in bit parts in TV movies and shows. Hardly anything substantial at all, but he was on the rise. He would later say, "I first heard about the XYZ murders when I was on a date with my girlfriend, and I got a phone call when I got back home to call the casting director Barbara Clayman. It was urgent. She called 3 or 4 times on the answer machine, and I called her back around 11:30 at night and she said, 'There's this movie happening in Detroit. It's called the XYZ Murders. It's directed by Sam Raimi, who just had a hit with The Evil Dead.' 'Yeah?' I said. 'That sounds kind of gory and trashy.' She said, 'It's the lead in a movie, Reed.' And I was like, okay. So the next day he was on a flight to Detroit, not knowing what he was about to get himself into. But by all accounts, he and Campbell actually hit it off well, and there were essentially no issues that resulted from this. He would also say on the tone of the film once arriving on set, "The way I've always described the movie is a Three Stooges movie directed by Alfred Hitchcock. The first day of filming, I had to do a take where my tie flew up and went woo 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 like this, and I thought, alright, I know what this is. There's no mistaking what this is." Now, from here on, we're going to be talking fairly negatively about Norman Lear and those involved at Embassy Pictures, but I don't want to paint them entirely as the bad guys in this situation as they have historically been. At the end of the day, film is a business, and as soon as they saw the ship beginning to sink, they stepped in to try and save their money that they had invested in this. Probably their first real mistake was actually funding the film to begin with. Because the fact of the matter also that you have to keep in mind is that Sam Raimi was 22 years old when he first started developing this project. And you would basically be an insane person to give any 22-year-old in the world millions of dollars, even if that 22-year-old did make The Evil Dead, and then send them across the country with that money with little to no supervision to make art and not expect a total unmitigated disaster to come from that, which is what happened here. I'm 100% for supporting artists, and I don't want to come across as if I'm not. But I also know the reality that pretty much everyone I've ever met in my life would have really dropped the ball in spectacular fashion if they were let loose to do as they wished with this amount of money in this situation when they were 22. Orson Welles was 25 when he made Citizen Kane, and that is an absurdly weird anomaly that has pretty much never been repeated since its release in 1941. That movie feels like it was directed by a man in his 50s. And in that same vein, if you were wondering, Crime Wave does feel exactly as if it were made by a 22-year-old. And so, even though from the filmmaker's perspective what the studio did was drastic, when that much money's on the line, I get it. Because for the first little bit, from what I understand, they did trust Raimi to know what he was doing and let him make his movie, but quickly realized that these people had no clue how to operate on a professional level in this environment yet, had no clue how the film business really worked. When first negotiating the film, Raimi said that he could make it for $2.5 million, which would be a little over $6 million today. But this estimation did not include any of the union fees for everyone working on this film, which did have to be paid. It did not include proper safety protocols, which they didn't have to follow on Evil Dead, as well as many other bureaucratic things like this that are both required and necessary when working on a large-scale production involving this many people within the actual film industry. So, they went to Detroit and started making the movie and almost immediately ran out of money. And because they had no prior knowledge of how unions worked, half the people they had already hired to work on the film were just their friends. So you have a weird combination where half the people were trained professionals that belonged to a union, and the other half were people that they just knew from high school who had no clue what they were doing, which only led to mistakes and miscommunication, with things taking more time to do and as a result, more money. They also did not realize that once bankruptcy happened on a film and a project went beyond budget, if the film was partially financed by a bank, which was the case here, then the bank has the right to step in and have a representative present on set to approve or decline all future purposes. The constant litigation over which made production crawl to even a slower pace, which cost even more money. Since they had done all of their own stunts on Evil Dead, it came as a surprise to them that the people in charge said that they, for instance, couldn't just lightly hit Sherry Wilson with this car in the first scene of the film, and make it look as if it hit her harder than it actually did. Stuff like this happened throughout the entire production, where they would secretly film a really dangerous stunt, and then get in trouble with it later with the union people. Such as this shot where the man's glasses explode as he's killed, which was done by literally firing 2 BB guns at his eyes at the same time. This sequence from the end of the film that you're seeing now wasn't properly thought out as well. The original idea was that he would chase her through these doors, and when the walls began to topple over him, he would run back through the doors and narrowly escape as they dominoed behind him. But they didn't do the math, and the walls were much heavier than they anticipated and fell much faster than they thought they would, and this actor was severely crushed by the weight of it, and it's surprising he ended up being okay and wasn't really hurt. The explosions on the freeway in this final chase sequence were not properly cleared, and created harm to the actual infrastructure of Detroit, and the burn scorches from them could be seen for years after this, as they weren't fixed after the production ended. These POV shots in that chase sequence were done by people actually standing on top of the moving cars themselves, and when they fall like this, it's because they actually just fell off the cars. In our final fight scene, when our hero and villain are fighting with broken pieces of metal on top of the car, Raimi wanted there to be sparks every time the metal hit against each other, which on camera looks great. But both of these fake sword-like things were hooked up to car batteries, and several people got shocked pretty badly filming this scene. You can also clearly see the cables that hook them to the car battery in most shots. Bruce Campbell, in reflection, would later say on the production, "I would say it was mostly luck that nobody got seriously injured or died working on this." There was a retirement home that they wanted to film outside of, because it had been placed in a classic Detroit building that matched the tone that they were wanting to aim for with the film. And they had no idea how to lease a location for a movie. On The Evil Dead, they paid $2,000 for the land for the entire movie's production. So they set up a meeting with the owners of the building, who were 2 well-known men in the area named the Hughes brothers, who quickly realized that these guys didn't know what they were doing and said that they would only lease the exterior of the building for the scene for $30,000 and 2 roles in the film, which they regretfully agreed to because in their mind the building was essential to the scene. Essentially being swindled out of way more money than the location was actually worth. That would be like today paying someone $80,000 to rent the exterior grounds of a retirement home for a couple of evenings. The scene at the retirement home was filmed at night, and along with the normal sound associated with making a movie, they also had these giant, very loud swamp boats shipped in from Florida that were put up on flatbed trucks blowing at all hours of the night to simulate the illusion of a storm. At one point, one of the windows on the upper floors opened and a hand reached out and dropped a glass bottle that shattered on the ground. There was a note inside that read, "The noise is keeping me awake all night long and I am getting sick. I am dying because of you." Within days of production beginning, Embassy Pictures fired Sam Raimi's production manager and put their own guy in to oversee the daily process of everything. They also demanded that all footage that was shot be mailed back to them in Los Angeles from Detroit, so that they could keep a watch over everything that was happening, as they had quickly grown to distrust the crew. Pretty soon after this, the new Embassy production manager got arrested for carrying a gun in an airport, and the film crew had to make do with the people that they had. Job titles stopped having meaning, people just did what they had to do to get this thing over with, and the daily grind of making Crime Wave divulged into chaos. Assistant director John Cameron said of the film, "I see Crime Wave as a real turning point, in a certain way, because if you survived that experience, nothing in the business could be as hard again." Filmmaker Josh Becker had signed on to be an extra in a scene, and at the time had this to say on that experience. "I worked the first 4 days, but I thought, like hell am I going to continue on this mother as an extra? It was so effing cold out here, so awful. Sam is shooting so slowly. I'm gone, man. Gone." Reed Birney would agree with this as well, saying only, "It was a pretty miserable cold shoot." Most of the interior scenes of the movie were filmed in a small warehouse that was never intended to be a soundstage, in which they had to cram several sets into a very tight space that was also horrible for recording audio, as the room had a very powerful echo. On top of that, seeing as it was just an old Detroit warehouse that hadn't been used in years, There was no functional heating system for the building, and they didn't want to pay to install one before shooting, and as a result, it was roughly below 0 degrees for most of the time that these scenes were filmed, even though they all take place indoors. It is also why everyone in the movie is wearing coats and layers even when indoors. The film was so miserable to work on that they couldn't get extras to agree to that kind of toxic environment, so the crew ended up being the extras when they were not needed somewhere else. Scott Spiegel can actually be seen several times in the movie playing a shivering man in the cold, an old man in the elevator, a homeless man in the alley, a man eating dinner in the restaurant, as well as several other times. Bruce Campbell actually got a phone call from Embassy Pictures saying that they had better not see Spiegel playing any more extras in the rest of the film, because it was getting distracting how many times he showed up. Because by the end of it, so many people had left the film, Bruce Campbell was eventually given a third job as being the second unit director, something which he pretty much had no experience with, and was given a list of shots that had to be finished very quickly. One shot in particular was a car driving over a bridge right at the edge of downtown Detroit. The only problem was that the river below the bridge was completely frozen, which would not make sense within the context of the story that takes place during hurricane season. They stood on the edge of the bridge throwing all kinds of heavy objects at the water trying to break up the ice, rocks, tires, trash cans, cinder blocks, and nothing worked. And so they literally went out with no permit onto the ice and laid out dynamite and blew up the river to get the shot. Also, you can definitely still see the bank is covered in snow in some shots, so at that point, why even bother? Also, because he was the second unit director, all of what he was shooting was pick-up cutaway shots and scenes. And so since they had very little help, if you ever see a close-up shot of anyone's hands doing something in this movie, it doesn't matter what character it's supposed to be, they are always Bruce Campbell's hands. By the end of the shoot, they were cutting things out of the film left and right to try and just finish it without spending any more money, which would result in the film being less than 90 minutes long. One planned fight sequence that was supposed to take place in the subway system was cut from the film by the studio, because it was deemed to be too ambitious and would cost too much to pull off. 20 years later, the storyboard from this sequence would be reworked as a jumping off point for a similar sequence in Raimi's Spider-Man 2.
We were dealing with unions for the first time, and so we didn't schedule it properly. Again, we didn't budget it properly. So we started to go over schedule, over budget, and the studio people said, they'd fly in their cutthroat men and say, what pages do we tear out here, And so the script would be revised in order to stay on schedule. And it was a lot of give and take. We didn't have nearly the freedom as our first film because investors aren't going to come on the set. A dentist isn't going to say, are you sure that camera angle's right? How many pages did you shoot today? They don't care. So they never set foot on the set. But with Crime Wave, they were in our face all the time, and it was a very tough experience.
The second the movie was finally finished filming, after a miserable 12-week shoot, Embassy Pictures, after watching a section of the rough cut, immediately informed the filmmakers that they would be forced to turn over everything that they had edited so far, which was only about half of the completed film, as well as any additional footage, and that they would not be allowed to edit the movie on the East Coast, and that all post-production would be handled under their supervision in Los Angeles. As Campbell puts it, so we screened it. Not for an audience or anything like that, but just for the executives, and well, the feedback was pretty negative. It got to the point that they wanted to recut the movie with a new editor, Michael Kelly, and so they did. Campbell, Raimi, and Rob Talpert went to Embassy in person to try and retain creative control over the editing process of the movie. And after Bruce Campbell spoke out against them in that meeting, one of the accountants at Embassy Pictures reportedly pointed a finger at him and said, "Look, asshole, do you have any idea how much you guys went over budget?" Embassy assigned them an editor to work with them to re-edit the entire film, and then decided that what they had shot wasn't working and would never work on its own. So the studio told them a full year after production had ended to call back the cast to film a new opening and closing scene to bookend the story, similar to what had been done on Invasion of the Body Snatchers. If you look closely here, you can see Frances McDormand in this sequence as one of the nuns, in her second on-screen role. The Coens are also featured here as the execution photographers. Sam Raimi would later say on the editing process, "That was horrible. It was the worst time of my life. I realize now that they were a bunch of idiots. Because if you're making a $3 million movie, you should let the director have a preview, Let him cut his movie. Let him put sound with it and watch it once. Don't look at half a rough cut before you've..." It was really wrong. It was such a horrible, 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 depressing scene. In this phase of the movie, Embassy Pictures also fired Joe LaDuca, who had composed the score for The Evil Dead, and was supposed to score Crime Wave, and replaced him with Arlen Ober.
They replaced my actors. They threw Bruce Campbell out of the lead. They threw out my musician, Joe LaDuca. They recut the picture. They had their own say with the sound effects and mix. They did everything they could to make it what it is today.
Also here near the editing phase was another major setback, as when they began filming the movie, the city of Detroit said they would allow the crew to use the police as much as they wanted to secure any downtown locations, and to make sure that everything flowed smoothly. And as soon as they were back in Los Angeles, they received a bill for $36,000 for police overtime labor, further pushing the film way beyond what they initially budgeted for. This also resulted in a dispute that ended with Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell's film company not being able to film in their hometown again for over a decade. The movie was deemed to be such an embarrassment to Embassy that they decided that they were going to cut their losses and were not going to release it in any form, and just shelved it, as to not look less prestigious on a national level. But they had a contract signed with HBO that promised a theatrical run before its premiere on their network, and so, as to not get sued by them, Crime Wave played in theaters in Kansas and Alaska, and made $5,000 at the box office, before quickly being lost in the history of bad movies that have congealed into a weird place of half memories. And what I'm about to say is why I don't blame Embassy for what they did here, because even though people commonly like to get mad at a studio for stepping into the creative process on a film, sometimes their interference does indeed save a movie and shape it into something watchable. I think most creative people need a good editor to make themselves look better. And not only that, but when we are talking about projects that cost millions of dollars, one wrong decision can lead to a cascading avalanche of misfortune like you wouldn't believe. One wrong decision could cost a ton of people their jobs, which is what happened here, as Embassy Pictures would run into financial troubles during the production of this, and would be bought out by Coca-Cola and Dino De Laurentiis, who would then close the studio and fold some of its employees and all of its assets into his own production companies, meaning that Crime Wave and Saving Grace, both released in the same week in 1986, would be the last two films to ever be released through Embassy Pictures. They literally closed and never came back. They don't exist anymore. The movie's failure was so depressing to lead actor Reed Birney that for a time he quit acting altogether and moved to France to be away from movies for a while. But he did eventually return and would go on to have a very successful career on stage and television. He would later say on the film's legacy after a space of a few decades to reflect on it all, "Look, I got to be the star in the movie, which I had never done before and I've not done it since. And I love that this is a cult movie. I've shown it to my teenage son who loves it. You know, it's all good. I was thrilled to have done it at the time, and 30 years later, I'm thrilled to be in it." Despite everything I've said, as a movie, it actually isn't the worst thing in the world. Is it good? Far from it. But it does show off some really strong creativity, ingenuity, and promise. The tone doesn't work for me in the slightest, but it is definitely a part of his personal style, which is evident in that this movie is essentially the tone of the emo Spider-Man section stretched into an entire film.
The problem with that movie, one of its many problems, was it didn't know what it was about. It was a comedy, it was a drama, it was an adventure picture, it was a love story, and it turned out to be none of the above.
So what did you intend it to be?
I wanted it to be the ultimate picture of entertainment. To thrill, chill, make the audience laugh, cry, scream. They screamed for their money back.
But there's some really great stuff here. Like all of Raimi's stuff, it is shot extremely well, and it knows exactly what it wants to be. The movie is really gorgeous to look at times. The gags are often really funny. In particular, the carpet scene for me. And if you go into this expecting a live-action cartoon, you will probably get more out of it than if you were expecting a neo-noir thriller. The car chase at the end is actually shockingly well done. And underneath all the weirdness on display, you can see a firm foundation of someone who knows how to put a film together. And in that way, I think Crime Wave is kind of fascinating. On home video, the movie was a big hit in Japan, which does not entirely surprise me, because just a few years from here they would go a bit Twin Peaks crazy, and while these two aren't really the same, tonally they share some similarities of presenting the American aesthetic through a wacky, surreal, cartoonish lens. But aside from that, this movie was a full-on train wreck any way that you look at it. I think Bruce Campbell sums up the whole thing better than I could when he said, "We learned from Evil Dead how to succeed, and we learned from Crime Wave how to fail. It's 100% true with Crime Wave that from failing we learned a tremendous amount." There's a part of me that's very glad that the movie just kind of disappeared. It just vanished for 15 years. We're proud of that. We put our blood into that movie and we failed, and I think it's a critical lesson for anyone in the entertainment business. Overall, Crime Wave was a lesson about abject failure no matter how you slice it. The film was a dog, and everyone involved can pretty much line up to take 40 whacks. As filmmakers, we failed to execute a misguided concept, and our studio refused us the benefit of any doubt. This film wasn't released, it escaped. I've talked about the nature of what it means to fail as an artist before. I mean, hell, we even talked about that substantially in the last video. So I won't rehash that here. But you can imagine that this was a real defining moment in the lives of these people. Everyone who worked on this has an inside joke that they refer to as their Crime Wave meter, that tells them instantly when a production is about to go south and fall apart. For a time, Bruce Campbell insinuated that the experience working here soured him entirely on the Hollywood system, and probably is what led him to having the eclectic filmography that he has had, appearing in larger productions both in film and television like Congo, The X-Files, and Burn Notice, as well as some really small ones like Alien Apocalypse, Bubba Hotep, and The Man with the Screaming Brain. He has said that in the years since Crime Wave, he has run into several executives who worked at Embassy Pictures at this time, and that the conversations with them always go the same way. They chat, catch up about how life has treated them in the years since. They talk about their work, family, and lives, and Campbell says that he is always the one to actually mention Crime Wave by name first, and that the conversation will then quickly end with a polite, "Well, it's been nice." The fact of the matter is that it is kind of remarkable that everyone on the production side of things walked away from this disaster mostly unscathed. Typically, when you have a situation this bad, it destroys at least a few careers. I mean, just look at Josh Trank. He directed 2012's Chronicle, made the most of a small budget, turned a massive profit, gave the first big roles of both Dane DeHaan and Michael B. Jordan's careers, and on top of that, was critically very well received. There was a similar anticipation of what he would do next. And then he made that awful Fantastic Four movie while also being an ass about the whole thing, and now he doesn't work anymore. And that could have easily been the case here, and it's a bit shocking that it wasn't. I think this whole story can stand as a bit of a parable about investing in projects and creators, about speculation of what someone is capable of based on only one success, about the power dynamics between creators and the people who fund their works, about not really knowing who you are going into business with, about how to conduct yourself when suddenly you have more attention and responsibility than you could have ever possibly imagined. And also a little bit about what it means to grow up and learn more about the industry that you suddenly find yourself to be in the midst of. So what do you do when you make a massive flop that jeopardizes everyone's careers who is involved with the production of it, that fails in every conceivable way to live up to the expectations that were created by your first film, and might prove that you in fact don't actually know what you're doing? Well, you go make Evil Dead 2.
I'm back to where I started, all alone and broken-hearted, without a sweetheart of my own. I'm feeling sad and lonely, 'cause I'm dreaming of you only, wondering where my turtle dove has flown. Remember when we met, I was trying to forget the only other love my heart had known. So now that you and I have parted, I'm right back to where I started, without a sweetheart of my own.